Welcome back to my channel, and today I wanted to discuss, yep, you guessed it, my homemade saddle. I spent a season in my homemade saddle through archery, through rifle season here in Pennsylvania, and I thought it'd be a good idea to give a recap on what I learned. This was my first year ever hunting out of a saddle, and I want to give a little bit of a background on why I chose to build my own DIY saddle. I got very interested in the saddles, and they have been around for a long time, but no doubt their popularity has dramatically increased in the last handful of years. I started searching on which saddle would be best for me to try it out, to get into saddles. It can be a bit overwhelming. No matter how many people you talk to, everybody has their favorite. Everybody has a favorite for a certain reason. I was having a hard time spending that kind of money, not even knowing whether saddle hunting is right for me. Maybe I totally wouldn't like it after a couple weeks of using it. So I set out to sew my own saddle. I'll put a link right up here to the process I went through on how I sewed my own saddle from scratch. Feel free to check that out. But now I'm going to give a recap on what I learned after using my own saddle. Will I be buying a commercially made saddle? What would have I done differently? What changes did I make mid-season? Follow along, it should be pretty informative, and hopefully you can learn something. So before we get into this too deep, I have to give my safety disclaimer. Safety is the #1 priority, and if you don't come home safe, any DIY project was not worth it. So you have to be confident in the products you're using. You have to be confident in the way you're using them. You have to do your research and know what the strengths of the products you're using. You can never be too careful. If you are not comfortable with taking that risk upon yourself, please do not attempt any of this. I'm not a professional, and this is not a step-for-step process on how you should do it. In fact, you are taking on all the risk if you choose to use any of my ideas, and any system or modifications that you come up with, you are going to be 100% responsible. So please keep safety in mind. You can never be too safe. In my original video, I hadn't spent a lot of time talking about my platform. I did DIY my own platform, and this was actually a seat from an old hang-on tree stand that I had. I did do quite a bit of welding and modifications to this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today either, but I could not be happier with this platform. If you're choosing to get into saddles, you're probably going to use a platform of some sort, whether that is a ring of steps, a screw-in steps, a commercially made platform, or making your own platform using your climbing sticks, something you're going to have to stand on when you get up there for your saddle. I feel I sort of lucked into this. I did a little bit of research, but I built in my own adjustment for leveling here. That worked great. The only real change I made to this setup throughout the season was I added some adhesive grip here around the edges and the top of my platform. As I said, I probably lucked into this a good bit. I was going to put a mesh, metal mesh type on the top. I found having these large holes that the seat originally had worked out great. I could stick my boot in here, push off. I could put side pressure on here. This really locked into the tree. Again, I'm not going to show step for step on how I built this, but a good platform is a must in saddle hunting. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of what I learned as a pure amateur to saddle hunting after my first season. Like I had mentioned, some of the things I've changed mid-season. Some of the things I haven't changed yet, but would if I had to do over again. I want to give you some of the tips and tricks that I have found worked for me. One of the first things to keep in mind is my homemade saddle. I had to couple it with a rock climbing harness, and that was to keep it as safe as possible, and that is the safety in my system. My bridge is tubular webbing, and that's attached to my tree tether. Now the tree tether continues down, and I have a Prusik knot. I have that tied into my rock climbing harness as well. So I have a little bit of redundancy for safety built in there. And if my bridge would break, my carabiner, my mechanical adjuster, if any of that should fail, I have one safety net there with this Prusik knot, having it attached to my rock climbing harness. One of the first things I did when I started hunting out of my saddle was to get the right comfort, start adjusting my tree tether, my bridge length, and a lot of these things just come down to personal preference. What works for me isn't necessarily going to work for you. You have to find what's most comfortable for you, and you have to be willing to toy around with it and adjust things, or else you're not going to be happy in your saddle. So for me, when I first started, I definitely started with my tether too high. I started lowering that tether, and it definitely became more comfortable for me. And the more hours I spent in the saddle, I started learning other things like my bridge. I originally started out with maybe a 32 or a 34-inch bridge. For me personally, that was way too long. I kept shortening and shortening and shortening my bridge. I think I have it down to around 26-inch bridge now. Again, that's going to be personal preference, but for me, the shorter I went with the bridge, the more comfortable it got. Another factor for me is I do a lot of self-filming, so I always have my camera arm mounted here, and the shorter bridge allowed me to maneuver maybe just a little bit easier. But I definitely went with a shorter bridge. I kept changing my knots here, and that's a nice thing about my tubular webbing. I kept shortening it and shortening it. Now, staying on the theme of my bridge, originally I had my bridge attached with water knots directly to the side of my saddle here. I soon became apparent that was not very comfortable. I would get a lot of pinching. There was no adjustment or no way that I could adjust my saddle. So the next thing I did was I made Prusik knots, and I attached Prusik knots here to my saddle. That definitely gave me adjustments. I can adjust now where that attaches, whether higher or lower. As you see in a lot of manufacturers and saddles, they have that built-in adjustment. Those Prusik knots were just a ticket, and that's exactly what I needed. Now I have infinite amount of adjustment the whole way around my attachment here on my saddle. Whether I want to hook low and put more pressure down underneath, hook high, put more pressure up here in my back band. That was definitely a must for me, and that was a good improvement. I did that soon after I started using that this season. Another thing that became very apparent and very important to me as I began saddle hunting were almost these pouches. They were a little bit of an afterthought at first, but I thought I would build them and maybe I'll use them, maybe I won't. But having some sort of dump pouches here, storage pouches on either side, were an absolute must. I honestly don't know how guys get away with not having them. I guess if you had cargo pants and always stored your things there. But for me, putting things in a backpack and then getting the backpack off here as I'm climbing the tree and getting settled in and trying to get all my ropes and gear out, it just was not working for me. These pouches were the best things that I put on my saddle, and I really wouldn't hunt without them. Another personal preference that I found out is I do not spend a lot of time kneeing up against a tree. I would say less than 25% of the time. In that time, I just never found it necessary to wear knee pads or carry any type of pad between me and the tree. Like I said, I honestly, and that's just a personal preference, I guess, I get comfortable enough in this saddle that I don't necessarily need knee pads or that extra weight or expense. I do lean against the tree some, but it wasn't enough to warrant any extra gear in that, and I honestly thought I might need some knee pads. I do not use any knee pads or any pad. I just found if you get a comfortable setup with your saddle, I just spend a lot of time leaning into my saddle. At one point near the beginning of the season, I did try a rope on my bridge as a bridge instead of the tubular webbing. I just really liked the tubular webbing. I just feel it slides through my carabiner not too easily. It has just enough resistance there that allows nice, slow, controlled movements. I stuck with the tubular webbing. I just did not prefer the rope. Now, a lot of guys are using AM steel, and I could see that might be beneficial, definitely lightweight, but for having tubular webbing and using that, I have no regrets with a tubular webbing bridge on my DIY saddle. For me personally, I did not find the need to add extra steps besides my platform. I always place my platform about the same height as my climbing stick, and that climbing stick would give me a range of motion. I could move around using just that stick and my platform. I just felt that was enough without adding extra gear and without adding a step maybe over on this side of the tree. You do have to be mindful when you're climbing. It's always a guessing game exactly where the deer are going to be coming from and which direction you should be facing. But you want to have that climbing stick placed on the side that you would think would be most beneficial to move around. I want to give some of my thoughts on saddle hunting in general. For archery, I liked it. With self-filming and the camera arm, I would say it was a little bit harder than what I do self-filming out of a hang-on tree stand or a climbing tree stand. That's not to say it can't be done, but it definitely added just a little bit more difficulty for me. I'm sure there's guys out there that have perfected it and that can do it better than me, there's no doubt. I'm going to continue to learn. It wasn't an absolute deal breaker, but it does make my self-filming just a little bit more difficult. I'm constantly having to pass my camera arm in underneath my bridge here, and if I have my bow in one hand, camera arm in another, it can be a handful and it can be hard to get quality footage. Now, a positive is I absolutely love having the cover. I feel more covered when I'm in my saddle. If I have a deer approaching, I'm always trying to keep that tree in between me and the deer, and especially with rifle, you have a built-in rest at all times. I absolutely love hunting with my saddle in rifle or muzzleloader season. It works with my bow, and I did hunt it probably mostly with my bow in hand. But with the rifle, it is an absolute blast. I love having the tree as a rest, and I love keeping the tree between me and the deer. I feel I can just hide really nice. I just feel more comfortable behind the tree as the deer approaches. One of the last things I wanted to touch on is a gear hook. I found a gear hook was a must. Hunt a lot of public land, so a screw-in option is just not an option for me. I went with a cam over buckle and some more tubular webbing. I found the tubular webbing in the cam buckle works even better than just a single strap. You get a good tight cinch when you cam over, and I actually DIY'd my own hook. Every type of plastic hook that I bought commercially to hang my gear on just did not suit me. I was scared. It seemed too fragile, and I wasn't willing to be confident enough to hang my expensive camera gear and whatever else. I found the best way, as soon as I climbed into the tree, I would attach my hook. That way I could take my backpack and hang it on that hook while I'm getting set up. I would then pull my weapon up and place it where my backpack was on that hook, and I would attach my backpack down here around my camera arm. Having a good gear hook is a must when you're saddle hunting, or at least it is for me, just because I need something to hang my gear on, and I wanted to get it up above my tree tether and my bridge. So what are my final thoughts? What are the takeaways? Do I like saddle hunting? As I mentioned, the reason I got into sewing my own DIY saddle is I just didn't know what commercially made saddle was going to be right for me. I am glad I DIY'd my own saddle. It definitely gave me points to look at when I am looking at saddles. Everybody seems to have an opinion on which saddle's best and which saddle works best for them, but you have to know what's going to work for you. I found a saddle with adjustment here is definitely going to be a must, because I had to have it here on my DIY saddle. I find that bridge adjustability is going to be pretty important. Will I be buying my own commercial saddle? I do like saddle hunting. I by no means hunted out of a saddle every single hunt this year. In fact, I would say it was about 50-50 whether I'd be using a climbing tree stand, a hang-on with sticks, or a saddle. The climbing tree stand and a hang-on accounted for about 50% of my hunts. The other 50% of my hunts, both bow and rifle season, I did use my own saddle here. I really enjoyed testing it out and learning to get more comfortable with it. Kind of felt like a new toy, and becoming accustomed with it. And I know safety should never be taken lightly, and calling it a toy might not be correct. But you understand what I mean. I really enjoyed this season getting to learn how to saddle hunt, what is the best techniques, what's going to work for me. There is no doubt in my mind I'm going to be continuing to use a saddle for a portion of my hunts in the upcoming years. I probably will be looking into a commercially made saddle. One of the biggest drawbacks with using a rock climbing harness and then my saddle is that's two different components. Now, while they do not weigh very much, my system, my rock climbing harness and my saddle put together weighs less than 2 pounds. So it's a very light setup. But it still has those two different components. You got to put on the rock climbing harness, and you have to have the DIY saddle attached to that. It would be so nice to have that all combined, and that's what all commercially made saddles, they combine the safety harness that is part of your saddle. The buckle on this black diamond rock climbing harness that I use leaves something to be desired. The way you have to thread it through 2 different ways with cold fingers can be very, very difficult. It's a little bit time consuming, so that would be a huge plus to have some sort of quick release buckle on my harness. So that would probably be something I would look for. So you're gonna have to wait and see. Will I end up in a commercially made saddle next year? Possibly. I definitely know more now what I'm looking for. But with that said, my DIY saddle was not wasted, and it is definitely a usable, safe system, at least in my opinion. Well, I appreciate you watching this video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them down in the comment section. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll try and get back to each and every one of you. As always, thanks for watching. We will see you in the next video.